Well, hello and welcome again, church family. I am joined by Dr. Andre and Mrs. Petrina Branch again. This is our third conversation that we've had. If you haven't had a chance to watch the first two, I encourage you to go to our YouTube channel, watch those first two conversations. We've gotten lots of comments about it, lots of folks who have found these conversations to be very helpful. As we said in the beginning, they're not the easiest conversations. Conversations about race are not the easiest conversations to have, but they are important. And so we're joining with these friends of the congregation. We're joined by these friends of the congregation again to tackle another 30 minutes or so of this conversation. And Andre and Petrina, let me just say thank you. You all have spent a lot of time with us already. And I know, I can only imagine as a parent and caring for parents. I know you have a parent that lives with you, a lawyer and a university professor. I mean, you just have all kinds of free time on your hands in life, right?
So we're just lounging on chase lounges in the backyard.
That's right. That's right. So the amount of time that you're spending here, it's so generous, and I want to thank you again for doing that. So we have briefly talked about some of the questions, so I'm just going to jump in. We've gotten some questions from some of the folks in the church, some of the people who have watched the first couple conversations, who are asking, could the branches say something about this? Could we ask them about this? And so we've talked a little bit. So let's just begin here. Lots of conversation nationwide about what it means to say Black Lives Matter, what it means to say all lives matter, the difference between those two, and why it would be significant at this time that we would be making the statement, not just that all lives matter, but a more specific statement about Black Lives Matter. And I wonder whether we might just begin our conversation there, helping us understand the difference between those two, the nuances, what that really means.
Okay, I'd like to, if I may, just make a comment about the branches making these different statements.
Okay.
The branches are not the final authority on any of these matters. We certainly value and appreciate the fact that our perspectives are appreciated by the congregation. But please know that all of the subjects, all of the topics that we are discussing and information about it is readily available in our society on those various resources that members of the congregation likely use all the time. So please feel free to continue to educate yourselves about these topics. We only have these 30 minutes to sort of whet your appetites for more information. Now, regarding Black Lives Matter, it's important to us that folks remember Black Lives Matter is a non-violent, peaceful civil disobedience and protest against incidents of police brutality against African American people. Black Lives Matter was started in 2013 to protest the acquittal of George Zimmerman in the shooting and killing of Trayvon Martin in 2012. Trayvon Martin was an unarmed 17-year-old child who posed no threat, and he was shot and killed, and George Zimmerman, who killed him, was acquitted. Mm-hmm. This group became nationally known, that is Black Lives Matter, became nationally known in 2014 following the police shooting and killing of Michael Brown. You will recall that Michael Brown was an unarmed man who had his hands up. The police officer grabbed Brown by the neck while he was still sitting in his car, pulled him out of his car after shooting him twice in the car. These two men, the police officer and Michael Brown, struggled. Brown ran with the police officer in pursuit. Brown stopped in obedience to the police officer, turned around, raised his hands, and the police officer shot him 4 more times. The official police report says that it was likely the final bullet that killed him. Why is there a focus by these groups and now thousands of Americans across our country on Black Lives Mattering as opposed to All Lives Matter? The phrase all lives matter deflects attention and corrective action away from the systemic racial injustice that Black people experience on a daily basis, and that we have experienced since Blacks were brought to this land in chains and placed into slavery. All lives matter turns attention away from the disparity that exists in equitable treatment for Blacks, whites, and other people in this country. I'll just say that in 2019, police killed 1,098 people in the United States. African Americans were 24% of that number at the same time that we were only 13% of the population. Black people are more than 1.5 times more likely to be unarmed when they are killed by police than white people. Black people are 3 times more likely to be killed by police. So Black Lives Matter calls attention to this disparity. It in no way suggests that the balance of the lives in the country don't matter. But if all lives matter, why then are Black people less likely to receive equitable treatment?
Yeah. I just like to add that, anti-Black racism is basically hardwired into Americans' DNA. Absolutely. From the beginning of time in terms of this country, Black people have faced just insurmountable odds. Roadblocks at every point in our history here. Black lives did not matter when we were, or our ancestors were brought here and enslaved. Black lives did not matter when we faced lynchings by the KKK. Black lives did not matter when the massacre at Tulsa, Oklahoma occurred in June 1921. Black lives didn't matter when we peacefully protested for voting rights. Bloody Sunday was a time when police, brutally beat peaceful protesters trying to march from Selma to Montgomery in support of Voting Rights Act. Other protests saw dogs put on us. So basically, it's important to use the term Black Lives Matter because the history of this country is that Black lives have been endangered at every turn.
Imperiled.
You know, at every turn. And, you know, as has already been said, certainly all lives matter, but we really need to keep the focus on the history of this country and the continuing injustices that Black people in particular face. I mean, right now, you know, we've seen the violence against Black people by the police. We've seen the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on Black people, both in terms of deaths as well as the economic impact. You know, SANDAG just issued a report, I think in the last week, that basically spoke to the disproportionate impact of COVID-19, both economically and in terms of the illness on Black people and other people of color in San Diego County. So that report is just out just now about our own county. So once again, I think it's important that people recognize that there are roadblocks and hindrances that Black people have faced both historically and currently that really need to be addressed, and the attention should not be taken away from that fact.
Yes, yeah, let me just build off of that and echo for a moment. As a biblical scholar, and talking to our church folks and reminding us that we actually have a story that speaks to, I think, this exact reality in the New Testament. And, you know, we have a story that we call the Good Shepherd. So there's 99 sheep that are in the fold, and there's one that is endangered. And Jesus says, I need to focus on the one who is endangered, right? I've got to find that lost sheep. And it didn't mean that the 99 weren't important. It meant that there was one that was endangered. And to just say, well, we've got 99, so who cares about the one, is not the biblical mandate. The biblical mandate was to care for the one who was endangered. And so if we have folks who are thinking through that, that might just be another tool in our sort of spiritual toolbox to think about that. So let's take the next step in the conversation today. So lots of conversation in our culture right now about Black Lives Matter versus All Lives Matter, and we've talked some about that. Also, lots of conversation about defunding the police, and it's really unfortunate that language and what it sort of connotes to defund the police. I wish there was a better way in which we could talk about that. But I think one of the questions that some people have asked is, defunding the police, would that actually be counterproductive to communities that are in maybe more oppressed or dangerous parts of a community, to have less policing there if we're defunding the police? Is that actually counterproductive and making things less safe for people? So let me just throw that out there, and we can go from there. There's a lot about that question, but I want to get more to answers than questions.
Well, to start with, I want to start with a sort of a definition of what defunding the police means.
That would be helpful.
Get started. So, broadly speaking, defunding the police basically means sort of reducing the role of police in our society. There are a lot of things that the police deal with that other individuals or professionals could do better. And so the suggestion is that maybe some of the money that is now being allocated to the police be reallocated into other types of social service programs, and or put more into the Black community. So let me just give you an example. Right now, the police deal with homelessness issues. the Defunding the Police suggests that let's reallocate money to homelessness services. Therefore, the police do not have to deal with those type issues. Police also get called to situations where people are dealing with mental distress. Mm-hmm. They're not psychiatrists, they're not psychologists, they're not social workers. Mm-hmm. So the funding from the police could be reallocated to professionals who, when someone dials 911 and it's a mental, say, distress situation, a social worker, a health professional, a psychologist, someone with those kind of experience should be sent instead of someone with a gun. Mm-hmm. Someone who has that kind of psychological based training knows how to de-escalate a situation and knows how to address those problems that those people are dealing with. A few years ago, there was a man named Alfred Alongo. He lived in El Cajon, and his sister called the police because his brother was having some type of mental distress crisis. The police came, and the long and short of the story is that they ended up shooting the man.
Within 6 minutes of arriving.
So that's a situation where if a mental health professional had come out, an unarmed person had come out, they could have talked to him and worked through whatever the mental distress was, and then, direct him to whatever services that he might need. By reallocating those funds from the police department to social services, you're starting to get to the underlying reasons why the person is in a situation where people now have the police come out to deal with it. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And one other situation that I wanted to raise is police officers are now involved in school discipline situations. We've heard numerous stories about a child acts up, the police get called. Now the child is put into the juvenile justice system. What if instead of having the funds used for police at school campuses, what if those funds were used for more counselors? What if those funds were used for people, for teachers and educators to get more training on dealing with discipline issues? What if those funds were used to fully fund services for students who have IEPs? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. In that way, we are dealing with the underlying problems and not just criminalizing problems. Absolutely. We shouldn't criminalize the homeless. We shouldn't criminalize students. We shouldn't criminalize people who are having mental distress issues. And in addition to that, every encounter has the potential of going wrong, meaning that someone gets killed.
Some life could be
lost. Life is taken. Mm-hmm. So that's the essence of what defunding the police is. People shouldn't be concerned that police are going away. There is a role for police, but it should be, reduced or changed such that they're dealing with things that they really have to deal with, and other people are dealing with situations that they're more qualified to handle.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Did you want to?
So there is in San Diego County a service, a resource called the Psychological Emergency Response Team. This service resource is funded by the county, and it pairs a specialist in psychological issues, mental distress, with police officers. Mm. They ride in the car with police officers to situations that call for a psychological expert. We don't have enough money. well, we have plenty of money, but we don't have money funding the PERT program. It's PERT, Psychological Emergency Response Team. If more money went to such a service, police would not go, as my wife just said, armed to situations that do not call for police with guns who eventually end up killing people. The research is clear that when police encounter a Black person, their training in de-escalation seems to go right out the window. They somehow are able to de-escalate encounters with white perpetrators, but not Black people. Consider some of the situations that in recent years police have been called for: operating a lemonade stand, golfing too slowly, waiting for a friend at Starbucks, barbecuing in the park, working out at a gym, campaigning. You know, a political official campaigning door to door has the police called on that individual. Moving into one's own apartment, mowing the lawn, shopping for prom clothes. Some of the members may remember an African-American woman was napping at the university that she attended, and the police were called on her. We don't need to spend money for more police as a society to have them go out and investigate these types of things. I mean, it just gets ridiculous. Not waving at someone when you leave the Airbnb that you've rented. We've had police called for that. Redeeming a coupon, selling bottled water on the sidewalk, eating lunch on a college campus, riding in a car with your grandmother, babysitting 2 white children. The assumption, of course, is that something is wrong when you see a Black person with white children. You know, the list of ridiculous events goes on and on and on. Nobody, to underscore what my wife has said, no one is calling for abolishing police departments. But we need to withdraw some of that funding and put it in places where it could best be used. And we need to remember why police, the very idea of police, were instituted in this country. Police were created to recapture runaway slaves in this country. That's why police were created.
So there's a long history of
using the police to control Black people.
There's just a long troubled history of relationship between police and Black people. You know, we saw that, you know, they were used to enforce the Jim Crow laws. I mean, everyone knows the story of Rosa Parks. The police were called on her because she was sitting in the wrong spot on the bus. We saw the police, you know, put police dogs on protesters, you know, in the 60s. We've seen the police, you know, use fire hoses on the police officers. You know, I mentioned,
on Black people.
I'm sorry, on Black people. I've already mentioned Bloody Sunday. So there's just a long, troubled history of, you know, relationship between, you know, Black people and the police. And I also just wanted to point out to everyone that, you know, in recent years, there have been studies about traffic stops. And I believe in 2015, the state legislature basically required that all police departments, as well as sheriff's departments in California, keep data on who stopped, why they're stopped, what happens with the stop. And just quickly, without getting into a lot of detail, I'm looking at one of the reports, or a story about one of the reports that was issued recently. And it said, Black people stopped by San Diego police and San Diego County Sheriff's deputies are searched more often than other races, even though officers find contraband on them less often.
That's right.
And essentially, what has been found is that there is strong indication that Black people in this county are being racially profiled by police officers. So essentially, they're being stopped. They're being stopped when they shouldn't be stopped. Mm-hmm. So we even see today, and people can go on the internet and pull up the results of those studies, but essentially we're seeing today the sort of over-policing of Black people and Black communities. So.
Some of you, I think in our initial introduction, 3 weeks ago, you learned that I am a former president of the NAACP. You may not know that my wife is also a former president of the NAACP. And when she was president, she worked with the former Chief Lansdowne in instituting the stop data recording that police in San Diego use for this data that she just shared. It was she who worked with the police department to create the system of collecting data of police stops. And she is too humble to tell you that.
Well, many, many years ago, as he was saying, I represented NAACP, worked with the ACLU and other people. We met for months with the police department to basically structure the process for collecting data on police stops. And I believe we are probably one of the earliest cities to start doing that, certainly in California. And
that data has consistently shown that African American people are profiled by the police.
Yeah. Essentially, Black people and other people of color are stopped disproportionate to their percentage in the population. That's right. And those stops are not producing, the contraband or some evidence that there was criminality. So essentially, they're being stopped because of their, because of the color of their skin. So the long and short of it is, let's defund the police is essentially, restructuring how the police operate, limiting the types of calls and types of involvement they need to have in the community, and using those resources to help address underlying conditions that might result in the need for less police involvement.
Yes, so thank you for that data, and I would encourage those who are watching to go and look at that data in your community, whether you're watching here in San Diego or elsewhere. I also know that other data that I have seen that can also be available is the kind of calls that police are called out on, as we were talking about earlier. So the number of mental health calls in a year versus a number of sort of noise abeyance calls and conflicts with roommates and right? All of these different kinds of calls that data is also out there. So I would encourage folks to go and look at that data as we have this conversation about not necessarily defunding the police, but funding better kinds of resourcing in our communities is really the conversation we're having. Now, let me just say, we've been in conversation for 30 minutes. I don't know how 30 minutes goes by so quickly when we all have a conversation together. So I do need, and partly because I have another commitment after this, to cut this conversation short, but let me just tell the listeners, the next two questions that we are going to, that this conversation will get into are along the following lines, and they sort of grow out of this conversation today. So one has to do with, there was a lot of backlash when some African-American and other athletes of color about 2 years ago began kneeling for the national anthem, and they were called unpatriotic, and lots of backlash about that, primarily from white owners of the teams that they played for and white politicians. And so we wanted to talk about some of that. And then also other questions that have come in, and I think really the conversation today, we'll remember this conversation when we ask this next question, and that is sometimes we see violence escalate on these sort of police cameras when the people are resisting orders from the police. And so why don't they just follow the orders? And you've answered many of those questions today already, but I look forward to a deeper conversation about that. That it's, as you said with Michael Brown, well, you follow the orders and still get shot, right? And so there's a long history of that. But I just wanted the listeners to know sort of where we're going next in this conversation the next time we have an opportunity to talk. And the explanation today and helping us understand why it's so important to say Black Lives Matter, and why at the root reorganizing the way in which we spend some of our resources is really helpful to me, and I hope helpful to our listeners. So let me just say thank you. Any last words that you would share? And I realize you don't speak for everyone, and you're not the end of this. What I feel like, though, is that you're friends who we can have an important conversation with.
Well, again, we are delighted to have this conversation, and it is so important that we ask why these things are happening, as opposed to just looking at the result. And I'm thinking about protests. Why are people protesting? Martin Luther King said the protest is the language of the unheard. If there's any last word, we'll just let that be the last word.
That's fine. To keep us to 30 minutes, I'll have any further comments.
Good. Well, thank you for your time again. God bless you. Have a great week, and we look forward to the next time in which we might be in conversation. So
sounds good.
Thank you, Pastor.
Thank you.